But yeah, today I think we focus on the sprouts we eat. And I have taken over to grow them here at GSC when Frederick left. I'm not sure when that was exactly, but at least 20 years ago. Does anyone remember when he left? Frederick, the French brother? Must be 10 or no, 20, maybe even 25 years ago. He loved growing sprouts and he was doing it in the flower room where I usually work. So it naturally somehow fell on me. It's not that I had a special interest in growing them, but I always liked to eat them. But then I agreed to continue to grow them, and I've done it ever since. And actually, they are a cheap way of producing healthy food, I feel, because the seeds are not really expensive. For decades, I have just used the seeds Bridgman had in the kitchen anyway. And that's mainly mung and lentils, a bit of fenugreek, and then also alfalfa later. But also I feel growing sprouts to gain a little bit experience might be useful at the end, because they would make a perfect crisis or end time food when there is nothing, when we can't buy anything fresh anymore, or if there isn't anything. Because sprouts have a really high content of vitamins, minerals, and they have life energy. So they're really highly nutritious and perfect to eat in those times. Anyway, but maybe especially in those times. The only thing you need, or we would need at the end if we want to grow sprouts, is fresh water. Because you need to wash and water them every day. You need to keep your utensils and the bowls and strainers really clean. That's important. So as long as we have fresh water, we can grow unlimited sprouts and they will provide brilliant food for us. So, and the way to do it, let me just start very simple for now. All seeds need to be soaked in warmish water first. Some like it hotter than others. And I usually soak them either during the day or overnight. So it doesn't really matter how many hours, 6, 8, 10, 12, it doesn't matter, really. From my experience, there's no difference. And then from that point, after soaking them in water, they have to be kept moist, but not wet. And there are different ways how to do that. Some people keep their sprouts in these glass jars with a gaze, or some people, when for smaller amounts, you have these plastic dishes that come in layers. But if you need huge amounts like we do here, then the easiest way is to use plastic strainers. And I brought them to show you. Look, these kinds of strainers, and then they sit in this bowl. And then it's easy to wash them and let the water just drain off. I find those the best for our situation and our needs here. And then that's it, really. Every day from that time onwards, then they need to be washed so that they don't dry out. If it's warm weather, it's good to wash them twice a day, but usually once per day is enough. And then I put a lid on top of the strainer. And it doesn't really matter. Some people think they need light, but actually they don't, because seeds usually grow underground. And they would grow anyway. If they're in dark, if they're in light, it doesn't matter. But I know that direct sunlight is too hot for many sprouts, so they would dry out and then they rot. So I cover them with a lid and they grow in darkness. And they do that perfectly well. Joanna, could we have the first slide? There are a few pictures I wanted to show, and Joanna kindly agreed to blend them in. I'm not sure what plant this is. I found it in the internet, so I stole this picture. But it shows quite well how the first shoot coming out is actually the root. So most of the sprouts we eat, and what we call the sprouts, is actually the root of that seed. And then the shoot, which produces the green leaves, or the plant or the tree or whatever, is actually another shoot which grows in the opposite direction. Okay, thank you. Maybe next slide now. So these are the sprouts which are my standard, because they are super easy to grow. And I use usually a mixture of mung and brown and green lentils, but it's like 70% mung and 30% lentils. But that's just because I like the mixture and they're easy to grow. Actually, they grow roughly the same time. And to produce something like this takes 2 to 3 days, according to how warm it is. What they do need is warmth. If it's cold, they grow very slowly. And if it's so slow that they sometimes start to rot. Or it's so cold that even bacteria wouldn't grow. Like when they're ready, you put them in the fridge, then you can keep them there for at least a week, as long as they are in a proper box or covered up properly so they don't dry out. So maybe one thing to say, mung is special in a way that mung likes to be soaked in very hot water. And I take it as hot as possible from the flower room. And actually Roy and I measured the other day, so I can tell you exactly how hot it is. And it was 58 degrees. It's quite hot. It's hotter than most water from taps. It feels really hot. I thought it was more. And it can be even hotter for the green mung. I used to take it straight from the urn we have in Tientoli. That's also possible. If you use only lukewarm water, you always find that some don't sprout, and then they're like stones in the mixture. But if it's really hot, almost all of them sprout. And another thing to know about green mung is that the big ones sprout much better than the small ones. So if you buy them, make sure they are called either big mung or jumbo mung or something like that. And from experience, you probably know how big they have to be big and how small the small ones. Whereas the lentils, it doesn't really matter, whatever. But they also need to be, let's say, fresh, which means only a few years old. A question might be, how long can you store the seeds so they still sprout? And I can say that we had some beans in storage for, it might have been 10 years, and they didn't sprout properly anymore. I had alfalfa seeds in storage from the time before we closed for refurbishment. So then that would be probably 6, 7, 8 years old. And out of those, only half of them was sprouting. So they can be several years old, but I wouldn't leave them much longer, if that helps. If you keep them for end times, it's good to rotate, that they don't get too old. Okay, so what kind of seeds can we sprout? Almost all seeds. Maybe show the next slide. This is wheat. Wheat is also, do you put anything underneath when you grow? I can't see the whole thing. Underneath what? Underneath the strainer? Yeah, I keep the strainer all. Yes?
Yes, underneath the strainer.
Yes, I keep the strainer in a ball.
Oh. You don't
And
put any cotton wool or mud or anything like in that picture?
no,
Just straight in the
no,
strainer?
nothing. No, I don't
Okay.
use anything like that.
Thank you.
But the strainer in a bowl, and when I wash them, I fill the bowl with water and then I sink the strainer with the sprouts into it. And then you lift the strainer out, throw the water away. I find that very easy. Okay, so wheat we can grow, but some people find it very chewy, so I don't really do it anymore. The next picture, I think, is mung, which we have talked about already. They grow really super, super easy. If it's warm, they can be ready in 2 days. If it's cold, it takes 3 days. But they have a flavor which is slightly nutty or pea-like even. And I find them very delicious. So for the containers, you have to see what your needs are. If you need lots, or if you just need a few. Bridgman also sometimes put sprouts just in a damp cloth, and they also grow. Sprouts really are very simple to grow. They, under almost all conditions, they grow. As long as they have some water, but not too wet, and a bit of air, and nothing else. You don't need to feed them anything else because the seed itself contains everything. And somehow, miraculously, the good contents, they multiply when the seed starts to grow. I don't know how that chemically or biologically is possible. That they say that the vitamin C content, for example, multiplies 20-fold or even more. I don't know how the seeds do it, but the content is highly, highly nutritious. Okay, so then another seed which is very popular and very tasty, and that's right, these are alfalfa seeds. That's this hairy stuff, very fine and thin, and they need very different treatment. Of course, they also need to be soaked like all sprouts, but because the seeds are small, you don't need to soak so long. For them, just several hours is fine. But it can also be overnight. It doesn't harm them either. Then the next slide, you can see what they look like once they have been soaked. So these photos I've all done in the last few weeks. No, not few weeks, in the last week. They are slightly swollen here after having been soaked for several hours. And because they are so small, I keep them in one of these metal strainers because the mesh needs to be very fine, otherwise they just wash away. In the next one, next photo. And then I just hang that strainer also in a bowl and put a lid on top. And then the next photo shows what it looks like after another day. And they have, after 1 day, they have already grown like this. Alfalfa seeds need roughly a week to be ready to be eaten, whereas the bigger seeds, the beans and the lentils and so, 2-3 days. Okay, then the next one. That's after 3 days. From day 4, I don't have a photo. The next one is day 5. Oh no, here this just shows once they have reached the size from the previous photo, then I transfer them in the same strainers which I use for the beans and the lentils. Okay, next one. This is now day 5, and you can see how nicely they grow. And just to show you what I do then, with these I like green leaves. So then they need to be exposed for light. So then I transfer them into these seed growing plates. I don't know how they're, propagators they're called, I think. You see on the next photo? Exactly. And then I keep them 1 or 2 days in that so that they are in the light, and then they develop within the day green leaves, and then they're ready to be eaten. But at this point, no, not that one. That comes later. At that point, we have to consider that they should not be in direct sunlight. That's too hot, then they would rot. Okay, that's enough for now with the slides. The other one we look at later. Okay, thanks. So alfalfa seeds are very delicious, but they are sensitive. They don't grow under, they need a smaller range of temperature where it's really warm. So they wouldn't grow when it's cool, and when it's too hot, they rot easily. And same as the lentils and the beans, they also need to be washed every day. When it's warm, twice a day. So it does, in growing sprouts, does involve some continuity. You have to be at home, you have to wash them every day, basically. If you go away for 2 days, then you can't do it.